And then you go from peak to peak because you go from the school to the play, not the play care, the play place, play zone. What the hell is the...
Ladies, gentlemen, and those with the good sense to do away with the whole notion, I welcome you to the premier audio medium for all your Fazbear entertainment needs. The Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. Note, FFPP is not responsible for any loss of appetite, disinterest, dismemberment, or other legally classified statuses. So strap in and enjoy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. I'm your host with the toast, Rye Toast here to talk about Not FNAF. I got you. You're trapped now. Don't leave. Please, we're going to talk about Poppy Playtime. Okay, to make it up to you, all of the questions are still about FNAF. Okay, the question section will be entirely FNAF still, but I gotta talk about Poppy Playtime Chapter 3. Holy shit. I wanted this podcast episode to go up last week because Poppy Playtime, but it didn't, so deal with it. That being said, for the future, if you want to send in questions about, like, other horror games in this space that you think this audience might care about, so stuff like Bendy, Poppy Playtime, things like that, feel free. This podcast is mainly FNAF, but it's FNAF and the grander sphere of things, you know what I mean? So mascot horror or just horror in general, I'm down to talk about. I might not know about the game you send in, but, you know, if I do, I'll talk about it. Anyway, Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 came out, and as everyone has been saying, holy shit, Mob Entertainment came out swinging with just a banger. Probably one of the best mascot horror games I've played in a very long time. And, like, I just keep thinking about between this, Home Safety Hotline, Shipwreck 64, 2024 has been an amazing year for, like, indie horror already, which is crazy to think about. Like, as kind of shitty of a year it's been so far, at least the indie horror scene is popping, you know what I mean? But to more specifically talk about Poppy Playtime Chapter 3, I think it's best to talk about it in relation to Chapter 1 and 2. So I never really covered Poppy Playtime that much on the channel. I did always like it. You know, I thought it was fine, but I didn't think there was much to talk about, especially like Chapter 1 presents interesting lore, but it's got like 30 minutes of gameplay. And then Chapter 2 gives us even more lore, and it's got like 2.5 hours of gameplay, but it's not scary. So I didn't really like... there wasn't a lot for me to talk about of those games. But since the ARGs have come out and Chapter 3 is here and it's amazing, I want to talk about this game so much. And luckily, it seems as though, like, fingers crossed, knock on wood, you guys seem to be receptive to me talking about Poppy Playtime. At least the Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 video I made did relatively well. In the past, when I talked about Poppy Playtime on the channel, it relatively bombed. I mean, I made a video about how Boxy Boo could be the antagonist for Chapter 3, and, like, nobody watched it. But this past one, you guys did. And I don't know if that's the hype or the fact that people are more inclined to listen about Poppy Playtime now that it's clear that the quality has gone way up. I don't know. You know, I don't know. But regardless, thank you so much for the support on that video. And I will be doing more Poppy Playtime videos going forward. Not too many, because there's still not a lot to talk about, especially compared to, like, a massive franchise like Five Nights at Freddy's. But there are definitely things I do really want to talk about in regards to Poppy Playtime. But as far as today's podcast, I want to talk about how much of a step up Chapter 3 is, and then just Chapter 3 in general. So, like I mentioned kind of briefly going through that, Chapter 1 had decent horror, but it was very short. And the gameplay was admittedly not great, right? Because Chapter 1, essentially, you're walking around, you do a couple puzzles, Huggy Wuggy jump scares you, and honestly a really good jump scare, because it's not like an in-your-face thing. It reminds me a lot of the tall man from It Follows. I think it's called It Follows. It's that one, honestly, not that great horror movie where, like, the monster is a euphemism for STDs, and it's, like, always walking and following you. Subpar horror movie, but that it reminds me of that really good jump scare from the subpar horror movie. Especially because it's a really good jump scare in a subpar horror game. But you get the Huggy Wuggy jump scare, and then he chases you, and the game's over, right? And it was more of a tech demo, which does annoy me because on launch it was $5. It's free now, so that's better. But it's definitely more of a pitch for, like, look, we can make a game, and that was it. But then Chapter 2 came out, and I've made a full video on my channel about why I think Chapter 2 isn't scary, And I'm actually really proud about that video. I think it was a really well-made video, and it was received somewhat well. So much so that actually someone from the dev team of Mob Entertainment on Twitter mentioned that like they watched the video and had some good takeaways from it, and I was like shell shocked that even happened, and I was like, I hope I wasn't too mean, sorry. And it was like, no, it's totally fine. I was like, okay, thank you for watching it. It scared the shit out of me. But one of my biggest critiques of chapter 2 was twofold. One, I didn't like that the horror and the puzzle felt separate. In the sense that there are those 3 mini games where it's like you're doing a mini game while being chased by like something that is going to kill you, like musical memory. There's Bunzo, Wacka Wuggy's pretty obvious. There's PJ and musical statue. So like that is like horror plus puzzles, sort of. But it's more like horror and minigame time, and then you go do some puzzles where there's no threat. And then horror and minigame time, and you do some puzzles when there's no threat. And then even in the final chase sequence with Mommy Longlegs, where supposedly you're supposed to be playing hide and seek with Mommy Longlegs, you do a puzzle, and then Mommy chases you. And then you do a puzzle, and then Mommy chases. It felt very disjointed. And add on to the fact that I don't think, in general, Chapter 2 is really that scary at all. I think they don't utilize their creatures well in Chapter 2, personally. And I go into this a lot in that video, where I think the main issue isn't necessarily the creature design, because I think there's some really solid creature design in Poppy Playtime. I think they just had an issue with utilizing their creatures. Mommy Longlegs being my shining example of that. As a creature, Mommy Longlegs in her entirety isn't that scary, to be honest, at least not to me. Like, her voice and demeanor is threatening, but she's never really that scary. I think Mommy Longlegs is scariest when she's appearing where you don't expect her. Like in musical memory, when she's like, take the train code, and then her hand descends from like the dark hole Bunzo was in and gives it to you. Or in the final chase sequence, when you're going through those pipes and she's reaching out from places you can't see. That's really good. And that's where Mommy Longlegs that's where Mommy Longlegs works as a horror creature. The issue is, when she's fully visible, I don't think she's that scary. Or at least when she's like in your face and like an understandable character, she's not that scary. Because I think the best horror is slightly unknowable, right? Like being just out of frame, or being just like you're not sure what they want, you just know they want to hurt you. Whereas Mommy Longlegs is very direct and very upfront. And as a horror creature, I don't think she is visually scary enough to pull that off. That's where my big problem was. Like, a perfect example I can pluck from the video, the opening cutscene with Mommy Longlegs, where she rips off your hand from the darkness and then like descends and threatens you. I think that kind of immediately dampers her character, where we have this, like, for a moment, it's great. Poppy gets dragged into a pit. We don't see who grabbed her. Great. Your hand gets ripped off. We don't see who did it. Great. But then Mommy comes all the way down and tells you exactly what she wants. I think that's almost word for word from the video. But that's the issue that I have, where like when she comes down and tells you exactly what she wants, she loses that unknowing fear factor. And because of her creature design, which does work in certain contexts, it doesn't work in this context for me. For me, I'm very numb to a lot of horror. So this is coming from that aspect. I always thought that scene could have been a lot better and a lot more effective if rips off your hands, but instead of her coming down, in that cutscene, she's holding Poppy and like puppets Poppy, and she's like, I think you should play along, like shit like that. If she did just that, like another hand comes down, still coming out of darkness, and it's holding Poppy, and it's like, actually, Mommy had a better idea. I think that would make for more effective horror. Personally, I like holding cards close to the chest, and then closer to the end, showing your hand, having that big moment. Kind of like what we see in Chapter 1. And again, in that video, I go into how Chapter 1 had really solid horror, where Huggy Wuggy, sure, we see him as a statue, but once he's an active threat, we don't see him until the very end. We just see that snippet. He's always nearby. Like, that's ideal. And then, like I said, my other problem was the horror felt very separate from the gameplay. Then Chapter 3 came out, and both of my biggest issues are gone. So, first of all, Catnap, as a creature, already just objectively scarier. Like, his design is objectively scarier than anything we've seen in this franchise so far. An amazing, they knocked it out of the park with the creature design of Catnap. And not only that, they still held their cards close to their chest. Sure, we kind of see him we see like most of him on the title screen, admittedly, but he's a little bit further back. He's not incredibly well lit. You know, he's there. He's a looming presence. And then in the opening of the game, we get that perspective of us being carried, and we see his face as we're falling through a tube. It's showing us, hey, here is your threat, but it's not in your face about it. It's still like a looming threat. Then we get the sections of the game where we get the platforming, we get a little bit of puzzle solving, and we go to the Home Sweet Home, the orphanage building of the Playcare. Not to mention the Playcare, like as a set and set piece, amazing. This giant metal dome inside of a vacant cave gives me like Portal 2 and BioShock vibes in the best way. And then we go in there, and it's this like, you can tell maybe originally this was meant to be a good place, but this is not a good place. And even like when it was an orphanage, it was not good, right? And I'll get into the lore later, talking about like the lore of the creation of the Playcare and stuff, but it really does evoke that good vibe of maybe this was built with good intentions, but it was used maliciously. And that's a lot of Poppy Playtime is good intentions that have been soured later on. And I think that's really interesting. That's kind of a theme going through the entirety of this franchise, is good intentions abused by wrongdoers, and the result of that. But speaking of themes, a big theme in this chapter, and most of Poppy Playtime, but it's really emphasized in this chapter in subtler ways, is hunger. Where like in chapter 1, chapter 2, it does present hunger. Like I know at some point Mommy's like, Bunzo's been so hungry, you know, and like it's said, but it's not really shown as well, in my opinion. Whereas in chapter 3, it's shown everywhere, and it's rarely said. It's said occasionally, but it's mostly shown. You can see it in Catnap himself. Catnap is a monster. He is huge, but he is skinny. You can see his spine, especially in nightmare form. You can see his rib cage. Like, he is gaunt. He is sickly. And it shows in that character. And immediately it's like, oh, this thing is going to eat me. And it doesn't need to tell you, I'm going to eat you because I'm hungry. You look at that thing and you go, oh, this thing is starving and it's looking right at me. Anyway, I got ahead of myself. We go to Home Sweet Home, and it's a nice area of, first off, you get this PT adjacent section where you're in the hallucinogenic gas and you're wandering through these hallways getting some lore bits from the radio, and technically you are not under threat, but you feel like you are, because they did that thing that I talked about earlier where Catnap is very present. He's just not actively chasing you. As it's explained in the chapter, Catnap likes to hunt. It's a feline creature, so it likes to stalk its prey, and we see that. One of the best jump scares in this game is after you get a phone call in this section, Ollie just says, you need to run. If you turn around and look at the doorframe, Catnap was watching you in the doorframe and just backs up and leaves. No stinger, no audio. It's missable, frankly. It's very easy to miss if you're not looking, and that's perfect. It reminds me of in Undertale. One of the little details of Undertale that people praise a lot for good reason. Throughout the majority of the game, Flowey's following you. If you go back to sections you were in, like if you leave a section and immediately go back, occasionally you can see Flowey there and he'll just duck away and run off. Flowey's following you the entire game. And once you realize that, it really settles in how menacing and like manipulative Flowey is in Undertale. And the same effect works really well for Catnap, where I've seen some people complain that like Catnap is barely in this chapter, but I couldn't disagree more. Sure, Catnap is only directly antagonistic to you in the final cutscene, in the final section, but Catnap is omnipresent in this chapter. The game really sells the idea that Catnap is always just out of sight. That's shown incredibly well in this PT section, right? And then at the end, you get that really nice, like nightmare huggy wuggy chase sequence, and then you're plopped into the actual Home Sweet Home. And when you're in there, you get good puzzle working in a scary environment that, while it isn't directly threatening, it's still combining horror and puzzle, where it's very unsettling while you're doing the puzzle solving. Like, that was one of my biggest critiques with Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, is all the puzzles were in, like, very clean, weird air duct environments where, like, there's no threat at all. It's pretty, like, well kept, and you're doing a puzzle. Now you're doing these puzzles in the Home Sweet Home, where there's noises around you. There's, like, clear evidence of dead kids everywhere in this section. There's the really sad set piece with Kissy Missy. Home Sweet Home is a beautiful introduction to how the game functions. And then you move on to the school, which I and a lot of other people would argue is probably the best section of this game, where the school is kind of a microcosm for, I think, the perfect gameplay loop of Poppy Playtime. New environment, introduce your player to how the puzzles work in this new environment. And now that they understand how the puzzles work, put pressure on them with an active threat and have them do more puzzles. And that is done beautifully in the school area, where you enter in, you're introduced to the new threat, Miss Delight, and she's like kind of in the background. She's over the PA system. You see her walking through a hallway. And then about halfway through, once you've done some puzzles and familiarized yourself with how this location works, here's your monster. And it's a weeping angel, which works so well with the environment and type of puzzle in this area, where instead of like in Security Breach's maze, where it's just you have to run really quickly, get something, and run really quickly back, and just try to avoid the endos as much as possible, it's less of a chase sequence, and it's more of a logic puzzle, where it's, okay, this creature will kill me if it corners me or touches me. How can I use its own gimmick against it to manipulate it to where I need it to be so I can solve this puzzle? The first time I played this, it actually glitched, and I didn't see her after the first puzzle. And I was like, oh, hell yeah, we got the best ending. On a replay during the charity stream, it's so much better with her there. Because it goes from, okay, I'm doing puzzles, I'm trying to be quick, to, okay, she is here. I need to go past her. I'm going to look around, look back, get her as close to me as possible so I can kite around her and walk backwards. And it's this idea of it's like I've always said, one of my favorite things in games is risk versus reward. And it is so clear in this segment, where it's how much time are you willing to risk not looking at Miss Delight to reward yourself with knowing where the hell you are. And it's this beautiful balance done really well in the final room of this puzzle, where you have to manipulate batteries in a very tight space. I could gush about the school for like a whole podcast. I think the school is not only one of the best, scratch that. I think the school is not only the best segment in Poppy Playtime so far, it's one of the best segments in Mascot Horror. It is so well done. Not to mention Miss Delight's like lore, backstory, and design. Like, designed-wise, amazing creature. The fact that she was hidden from all marketing, done so well. I can't commend the design of Miss Delight enough. But her lore is really interesting when you get those papers. So for those of you who missed the notes that she leaves, the whole thing with Miss Delight is there was, I think on the tape we see 8, but there is some number of the Miss Delight teachers at the school. And then after the hour of joy, Catnap locks them all in and waits until one of them comes out on top, essentially. And the Miss Delight we encounter is the one who made a weapon, who loses her mind and starts talking to her weapon, and eats the other Miss Delights to stay alive. And once all of that is done and she's like riddled with guilt, there's the one haunting note where it's just like, I didn't mean to, or like something like that, where like she you can feel the anguish of like, I didn't want this, but I needed to live. And she's crazy at this point. Catnap unlocks the door. And then there's that note where she's like, I know Catnap did this to me, but I know he can kill me in an instant, so we'll work together. And then you get that realization that even in the one section where Catnap does not go and we never see him, his presence leaks into it. Miss Delight and the school is like this because Catnap made it so. And that's just such a sick, dope moment. And then you go from peak to peak because you go from the school to the play, not the play care, the play place, play zone. What the hell is what is it called? Not to mention that place. Yuck. I gotta look it up because I don't remember it at all. The Playhouse. I'll leave the wiki page open if I need it. But then you have the Playhouse, which a lot of people will agree has one of the best scenes in mascot horror, period. So the Playhouse itself, right, it's one of those things where it's really it's a good set piece. It's less of a puzzle and more survival. There is that like puzzle near the end, but again, it's more just like manipulating and getting to where you need to go around the smiling critters, which are very well done. I think the idea, the choice to have your like lighting system instead of a flashlight be a flare gun is really interesting, right? Because you have to, again, risk versus reward. You balance how well lit do I want this area to be, but how many flares can I conserve to protect myself? Excellent choice. I'm surprised it's taken this long for a horror game to use a flare gun as its main source of light and defense. That's great. And then of course we get at the end of this we get Dog Days cutscene, which Dog Days cutscene is just, it's so good. Like the idea of these critters crawling into this man, essentially eating him out from the inside and then puppeting his body to kill you is horrifying. If this wasn't toys, this would have to be like an adults only rated game. That's like the concept of that is disgusting to think about. It's already so effective as toys, and I think it's really primarily effective because it is toys. Because if that was a real body and these are like weird little flesh gremlin creatures, it would be too grotesque to be scary. It would kind of lean into where I think a lot of modern Saw ends up, where it's more gore for gore's sake rather than effective horror. Meanwhile, because they're puppets, it's so much more effective and like understandable on the surface of it. They're not puppets, but they're toys. You know what I mean? But yeah, after that, I think it does slow down a bit. I would say the counselor's office, it's less effective, mainly in my opinion, because of the Home Sweet Home section. The counselor's office to me feels like the Home Sweet Home section again, where it's a creepy environment that you're doing puzzles in, which after the school and the playhouse feels like you're losing steam, because like puzzle and threat, just puzzles. So I think the counselor's office maybe needed some kind of threat, just so like we had to stay on our toes. Granted, you could argue that after the school and the the school and the playhouse back to back, the player needed a breather, but maybe not for that long. Maybe, in the counselor's office, we do go outside the dome for a section to do some puzzles and go back in. Maybe that segment we add in a threat. So the first half of the counselor's office, we're not under active threat, so we can catch our breath, and then halfway through, like the school, introduce a threat so that we do have to be more present. And maybe that's catnap, right? We've had Miss Delight, we've had the smiling critters, now there's catnap. And instead of like how active he is during the boss fight, you can introduce him here by having him creep around the sides and using the flare gun to scare him off like a smiling critter. Something like that would have made the counselor's office a bit better in my eyes. But the counselor's office already is a really good section. I think it just feels like you're losing the momentum you've been building over the past two sections. Then there's one really frustrating moment before the boss fight that I think does need to be worked on. And that is, for whatever reason, I don't know if this is just my game, but I've seen it every single time. You leave the counselor's office and Ollie's like, oh man, that didn't work out well. We'll just plug in the generator from the counselor's office and let's go. And you plug in the power plug from the counselor's office. And instead of going to 100%, it goes to 96% and you get a key to the Sky Dome, which I didn't remember. But if you somehow remembered, is the place where you meet Poppy and Kissy like halfway back in the game. And you have to take the key in a completely pitch black play care. You have to take that key to the Sky Dome and plug in one more cord without being told to. That's weird. And like once you do that, you get the battery, which allows you to do the end of the game. That's weird. That needed to be more clear. Maybe when we left the play care, we could have done the Sky Dome key then. To me, that feels like there was something that got messed up and there was a Band-Aid put on at the last moment. I don't know. It's really fresh. I've seen a lot of streamers run into that moment of like, okay, let's go. Wait, why am I stuck here? Why can I not go anywhere? I'm in a dark location. I don't know what to do. And that sucks to happen right near the end of the game because that just puts a sour taste in your mouth. You know what I mean? But that aside, the catnap boss fight. There's been a lot of discourse on the catnap boss fight. Before we get to the discourse, nightmare or like the like hallucination. I think my brain was combining hallucination and hallucinogenic into like one word to make hallucination, which isn't a word. But the hallucination catnap, amazing design. The idea that, because we hear earlier in the game that there's this pale monster that was scaring her. We're like, what the fuck is a pale monster? Catnap's purple. Is this something we haven't seen before? And then we see Catnap under the effects of his gas. And it's like, oh, that's the pale monster. And the scene where you're going up the elevator and he's crawling gives you that perfect moment of like, okay, this is what this creature looks like. This is what we're about to fight against. That's a great moment. The catnap boss fight, in concept, is wonderful. The idea of like a classic sit and survive style game where you have to defend yourself from catnap trying to kill you while buying enough time to charge up electricity, that makes a lot of sense and it works. And to add on to the fact that you have these really good defenses that you have to slowly sacrifice to continue to progress in this fight, a brilliant concept. In concept, the catnap boss fight is amazing. The execution is a little rough. I've got two major critiques with the execution of the catnap boss fight. One, it feels really out of nowhere and isn't explained super well, right? So there is the monitor that like will flash different messages of like, here's where you are, here's what you do. One, it's not super clear like, hey, look at this monitor and watch it while it pages through stuff, because there's no way to next it. So like when I first came in, I walked up and it said like, this room might keep you safe. Be wary, catnap is coming. And I was like, okay, cool. And I stopped looking at it and I missed every other instruction. So there probably should have been like an arrow, not necessarily like the player needs to hit it, but some indication that the screen is going to change, because there isn't. And a lot of people miss that. But because it's so out of nowhere and things we haven't done before, it's really hard to learn. And I think that's the main issue that a lot of people have had, where like once you know how the catnap boss fight functions, it makes a lot of sense and it's really like, it's good to play. The problem is it takes a long time to learn how the catnap boss fight functions, and it's really unforgiving in trying to learn it. So I think a Fizna mentioned if we used the Steam on catnap at any other point in the game, it would have clicked a little bit better. And maybe that could have been in that counselor's office. Like maybe there are sections where catnap is chasing you and you have to break a pipe to have steam come down to make it run off. And then like that clicks, okay, steam like is enough to scare off catnap. You know what I mean? So something like that would have been great. So like we know when we pull something and steam happens, immediately the player's like, oh, this is one of the defenses it's talking about. Another thing, I know it like makes you use the stuff before it activates so that the player has to know what they're doing, but I saw so many streamers just like accidentally power something and then start the boss fight. So again, it comes down to being able to teach the player what's going on. So I think if these, like we saw in the school, right? All the school puzzles were demoed before there was a threat. Whereas the catnap boss fight, there wasn't a demo before there was a threat. Like technically, yes, the boss fight doesn't start until you activate it, but it's just not super clear. So I think if there was a way to introduce the concepts used in the boss fight before the boss fight, it would have been a lot smoother and felt a lot more intuitive, because right now it feels not that intuitive. At least that's the feedback I've been seeing. My other issue with the boss fight, and this is very nitpicky, The boss fight attacks are very RNG dependent. In fact, it feels like they're entirely RNG dependent. And don't get me wrong, in a boss fight, the attacks need to be RNG dependent in some way. But they're so RNG dependent that half the time when I've seen people play the catnap boss fight, the way that it goes is they die really early on, like 4 times in a row, and then they get a run where the catnap attacks like 4 times and they win. And that doesn't feel rewarding. So I understand there needs to be RNG in when it attacks and where it attacks, but I think there needs to be tighter bounds so that, like, he still is guaranteed to attack a few times at least in a boss fight, but he's not going to attack every other second. You know what I mean? A perfect example of this is in the charity live stream. Like, my first 2 attempts of the catnap boss fight, I got attacked like 3 times in 30 seconds and could not keep up and died. And then like the 3rd or 4th attempt, he just didn't attack for like 2 batteries worth of time. So it feels the RNG is too loose. I think there needs to be tighter bounds on the RNG for that. All that, like, negative stuff aside, so now that the critiques are done, as a boss fight, like I said about the concept of it, now, once you know how to do the boss fight, it is a beautiful blend of the 3 mechanics the game has taught us so far. Using the green hand to charge things to attack with, using the purple hand to get to the different location, and using the flare gun to see what's real and what isn't. It's an amazing combination of these mechanics. I just wish it was taught a little bit better for the player's sake. On a replay through, it's a great boss fight because I already know what I'm doing. On a first playthrough, it's rough. And then after the boss fight, the Hour of Joy cutscene where we see on the VHS tape. First off, like the second VHS in the entire game to have video, which helps it to stand out. But holy shit, Poppy Playtime is not pulling punches with its deaths. Because, man, the Hour of Joy just littered this factory with bodies. Holy shit, this is a high death count game all of a sudden, which just makes me really excited to see what we'll see moving forward. I wanted to talk about, like, the lore and like ideas for chapter 4 and what we might see, but we're already almost at like 30 minutes. I might have to talk about Poppy Playtime again on another podcast episode. So if you guys, let me know in the comments, not to just engagement bait you guys, but like, do let me know in the comments if you want more of these like Poppy Playtime or other horror game focused FNAF podcast episodes. Because it's a FNAF podcast. I understand if you only want to come here for Five Nights at Freddy's. I totally get that. But let me know if it's all right if we switch it up every now and then. But again, all in all, Poppy Playtime Chapter 3, one of the best mascot horror games I've ever played. Really, really solid showing from Mob Entertainment, and I think it earned back a lot of trust from the community for what they have for us moving forward. And anyone else out there, as a lesson to any other developer in the space, you can get engagement, you can get purchases, you can get monetary sales from good work, not just flashy. I'm talking to you, Euphoric Brothers, and every other like up and coming like independent horror game dev who sees that like Garten of Banban is wildly successful and goes like, oh, I guess I don't have to try and I'll just get money. No, you can try and get money, because I'm sure Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 is selling well. And I think the lesson here, right, is you can make good art and good horror and still make a profit. Not to say Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 or 2 was like just for profit and like some sellout thing. I'm not saying that at all. Don't misunderstand me. I think it's a good... There's been a lot of games that have come out recently, like Garten of Banban, like a lot of the one Poppy Playtime ripoff that Daco played that was literally like another horror game set in a toy factory. What the hell is going on or whatever? Like that, like shit like that has been coming out a lot. And it seems like the idea was, okay, well, if I want to make it in mascot horror, I need to make just a brightly colored, shitty horror game with some puzzles in it. No. You can make it in mascot horror with a good product. And Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 is evidence of that. Because so many people have been playing it. So many people have been streaming it. It is a huge thing. And it deserves to be, because it's good. It's really good. And that's just the be-all, end-all. Like, it's not because it's flashy or because kids love it. It's because it's fucking good. But yeah, I like Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 a lot. I think this week is going to be the week this comes out is going to be the video where I talk about Poppy Playtime Chapter 3's horror. And if you watch this podcast, I'm going to reiterate a lot of that stuff, but in a cleaner, more condensed way in the video. So be ready for that. That being said, let's move on to some questions and talk about Five Nights at Freddy's, the reason a lot of you listen to this podcast. So if you have any questions or theories you want talked about on the podcast about FNAF or other horror games, send it into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. The link is in the description. If you don't want to type it, just copy and paste it because it's a pain to type. But I got 4 questions for us today. The first one comes from Jacksity, he, him. Thank you for your question. In the Curse of Dreadbear DLC for Help Wanted, in the barn, there's a poster for FNAF 1 Chica, the same poster as in FNAF 1. If FNAF 1 Chica wasn't made until at least after FNAF 2, which is in 1987, and Curse of Dreadbear takes place in Fall Fest of 83, what does this mean? That the FNAF 1 era robots existed during the Fredbear era? Thank you for your question, Jacksity. It's interesting to think about, right? Because we talk about the Wizards in FNAF 2 and how the FNAF 1 versions of the Wizards are like redesigns because they don't look like the Wizards do. The feathers are different on Chica, her toes are different, like they are different designs. So it's one of those questions we have to ask where there's honestly a lot of possibilities for what this means. It could mean, easiest answer, Help Wanted is a recreation of things like Fall Fest, FNAF 1, FNAF 2, FNAF 3. So if something in Help Wanted isn't fully accurate, that could be why. That Fazbear as a company wants to present the most modern version of their characters. So possibility number 1, and the most straightforward possibility. Possibility number 2. This may or may not be a more likely possibility. It depends on how you land on what is accurate and inaccurate. But something to keep in mind is Help Wanted is also the game that introduced the indie dev theory, that some indie developer in-universe made video games based off of Fazbear properties. And those video games, while they were the Fazbear said, oh, they're completely fictional. But the thing we find out in game is that those games are recreations of real events that are meant to discredit and scandalize those events so they're less credible, right? So I've been taking that to understand Help Wanted is telling us that every game before Help Wanted might not be fully accurate. And all that means is that, like Help Wanted says, these are recreations of real things. So the events in these games still happened. It's not saying that everything before Help Wanted, throw it out the window. But it is introducing the concept that they are video games made by a game developer, which means that all of the games now have an unreliable narrator. That being said, I think it's more so, I think that part of Help Wanted is to tell us that if there is like minor details that don't line up with what is actively being presented Help Wanted onward, those minor details are inaccuracies by the game developer. One of those examples being that FNAF 1 Chica poster. It's possible that Help Wanted is telling us that the FNAF 1 gang always kind of looked like that, and the withered designs for FNAF 2 looking somewhat differently, like Chica's feathers being different and her toes being different, that is the game developer getting it wrong. And in actuality, there were the withered animatronics at the FNAF 2 location, but they were withered and looked like the FNAF 1 animatronics. So that might be the other thing it's trying to tell us. That in the Fredbear era, that first OG Freddy's restaurant, the animatronics looked just like they do in FNAF 1, just newer, you know? And then when they're withered, they have those same withered, like, problems and damages, but they don't look like different animatronics like they do in FNAF 2, which could, again, Scott was a new game developer, right? It could be on purpose that they look different because the original Freddy's animatronics look very different, and when they're refurbished, they're changed to look like what they do in FNAF 1. But there's the other possibility that this is Scott saying like, hey, that should have been more on model. That's my bad. It was FNAF 2, the game I made 10 years ago at this point, 3 months after FNAF 1, you know? So it's one of those things that early on in the franchise, maybe that was a mistake. Or it wasn't. You know, like, I don't want to just assume it's a retcon. So there is the first explanation where Help Wanted is an in-universe game where they might just want to present, like, they might have not fully accurately recreated Fall Fest. You know what I mean? So there's that, and that would not be a retcon. The retcon answer is that this could be, and it's still an in-universe explanation. Like, neither of these, like, technically the second explanation is a retcon, quote unquote, but they're still both in-universe explained, where the first option that I can think of is that Help Wanted isn't fully recreating Fall Fest as it was in 83 and is using more modern imagery. Or, in FNAF 2, the Wizards look a lot closer to the FNAF 1 animatronics because they always have looked like that, and Help Wanted is telling us, hey, that was the game developer getting it wrong. So those are the two options I can think of. I'm sure there's other explanations, but that's what I can think of for an explanation. But thank you for your question, Jaxity. Moving on to our next question from Mary ZZM. Thank you for your question. Hey, Rye, I haven't seen people talk much about this, but what was up with the Springlock Ella doll in the FNAF movie? Why Ella of all characters? Why was it Abby who was being stuffed? It seems suspicious with Ella being related to Charlie more than Baby, especially since, according to Entom in his video about the original draft of the movie, the Springlock Ella doll had a small claw-like mechanism. Thank you for your question, Mary. Yeah, it's really interesting, right? I think I've talked about this before, but I didn't come to any conclusions, and that's because I don't really have any. But it's really interesting that the FNAF movie seems to be using, I would argue, it's using Ella as a replacement for Circus Baby. And I don't know why. One of the thoughts I had is that when making the FNAF movie, they're trying to make it just like slightly more realistic. And the sister location animatronics has always been a hard sell, right? Because they're these really futuristic chrome animatronics that are incredibly sophisticated and advanced and are one of the oldest animatronics in the series. So that was always kind of a hard sell. So I wonder if the use of the Ella doll was less specifically because it's the Ella doll and more because it kind of looks like Circus Baby a little bit, and it could be the sister location animatronics for the FNAF movie. Right now, this would be, again, the FNAF movie seems like it's definitely its own separate timeline. And in this timeline, we might learn that the sister location animatronics do exist and serve a similar function, but look closer to like what the Ella doll looks like. That's my first guess, and I think that's the only solution I can come up with that makes any modicum of sense, is that it's just a hard sell to like have these really aged, decrepit FNAF 1 animatronics and then have like a shiny chrome Circus Baby in the back and be like, oh yeah, that's a really old model. What? To an audience that doesn't know FNAF, that is a really hard sell. I think there are other valid explanations, but that's what I think of. But thank you for your question, Mary. Our next question comes from Gemma, she, they. Thank you for your question. Many people believe that because of the references to Fall Fest that we've gotten in Help Wanted games, we will eventually be seeing Fall Fest again in a future game or DLC. What do you think a game like that would hypothetically be like? Do you think it would be more minigame based like Help Wanted, or a linear storyline like the Room DLC, or something else entirely? Thank you so much for your question, Gemma. Also, Gemma, you included some really dope art, and thank you for that. I'll put it on Right Heart if you are comfortable with that. And if not, I'm going to cut this out. Nobody will see it. I've been thinking a lot about a Fall Fest game. So, like, immediately, it's not going to be a classic FNAF game. I don't understand how Fall Fest could function as a sit and survive with cameras. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. What I could see happening is like what we saw in the Dark Circus for FNAF AR. Now, I've never played Dark Circus myself. I've just seen it be played because it's really cool. One of the coolest things FNAF AR did, RIP, but essentially it was kind of like an escape room type game where you're like looking for clues, looking for things, you face off with a couple animatronics. It's this really cool concept. And when I think of a Fall Fest game, something like Help Wanted does make sense because there would be attractions at the Fall Fest. But I don't think they do that because in Help Wanted 2, it seems like we already got a lot of minigames at Fall Fest. So if I had to guess, I would say it's either going to be something kind of like Ruin, where it's a linear story experience, which, again, would present a problem because if I think of what Fall Fest would probably look like, it doesn't lend itself to a linear experience very well. Something that it might actually be close to, ironically enough, is Poppy Playtime Chapter 3, where we have the playcare and the various environments within the playcare. I think something like that could make a lot of sense for Fall Fest. Where if we do have this Fall Fest game, we have a big environment with smaller subsections of environments, and we unlock abilities to go to those different subsections, each holding like essentially a different chapter of the game. That would make a lot of sense for me, and maybe we're like a kid exploring it, maybe we're Henry trying to ruin it, and that's why William hates Henry. I don't know. Fall Fest presents a lot of opportunities, but I think the idea of like, here's a big environment with smaller subsections that you go one by one to by unlocking them. I think that makes the most sense for Fall Fest without knowing anything about it. That would be my guess. But thank you for your question, Gemma. We're kind of speeding through these. I didn't mean to, but we are running long, so whatever. But our last question comes from Ray. Thank you for your question. You asked, FNAF 6 / Pizzeria Simulator has multiple endings, but it's always assumed the true ending is the burning of the pizzeria and the animatronics within. However, between Security Breach, Ruin, and Help Wanted 2, we can see that there's very little, if any, fire damage in the FNAF 6 location. Since we know at least some of the animatronics survived the end of Pizzeria Simulator, is it possible one of the other endings is the true ending and the fire never happened? Thank you for your question, Ray. So, on the face of it, I think it's possible. I don't like that, and it's really unfulfilling. It is possible. I don't think it's likely, though. I think Burn Trap is way too red of a herring to not be what it actually, like, is not, to not tell us, hey, Burn Trap is the result of a fire, right? And I agree with you. There isn't that much fire damage that we see in Ruin and Security Breach, but there still is fire damage. If you look on if you go out of bounds in Security Breach and you see into those rooms, they are already burnt. And then in Ruin, they're not like destroyed or anything, but it seems like the fire has been used. I'm pretty sure anyway. Yeah, okay. So I'm looking at it again. It's not like, I wouldn't say the place burned down, but we never argued it did. It's just there was a fire within it. And there is burn marks in the area. Like one of the doors, I'm pointing at my screen like you guys can see it. One of the doors in there, it's a metal door, but the top of it is like black and there's that like ring on it. So it's like there is burn damage in the area. It's just not fully burnt down. So I would argue that the burn ending is still the canon ending. But it would be interesting to think about that not being the case. I think either way we end up at the same result, where even if the burn everything to the ground ending is canon, there's no guarantee that it worked, right? Like, it's all based on a hypothesis William had that overheating might neutralize Remnant. So whether or not the fire ending happens in FNAF 6, you can still have characters carry over if you think that makes sense, right? So I would argue that the burning everything down ending is still canon, but it doesn't necessarily have to be canon, to your credit. Because there is evidence of burn damage in both Ruin and Security Breach. But thank you for your question. Once again, if you want your question or theory talked about on this podcast, you can about FNAF or other horror games, you can send it to Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. That is in the description to copy and paste because it is a pain to type. But until next time, as always, thank you all for watching the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, where the pizza abilities are endless. We hope to enjoy your future patronage. Bye-bye for now.